Hey guys, welcome back to Math Principles. Today we're going to take a look at solving some basic algebraic equations. I saw last week that some of us are having a little bit of trouble with some of the key concepts, and I want to make sure we get that nailed down before we go on to anything more complex. So let's start with the fundamentals. If I want to solve a regular old algebraic equation, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with something that's kind of elementary, but it's really helpful to keep the equations balanced. So let's have this in our habits. Let's start by drawing a vertical line. Okay, if we draw a vertical line through the equal sign, what that's going to allow us to do is help keep that equation balanced. Because whatever we do to one side of an equation or an inequality, we need to keep in mind that we have to do the exact same thing on both sides. That vertical line helps us make sure that happens. So draw that vertical line right down the center of the equation. Now, we're going to skip steps 2 and 3 right now. Steps 2 and 3 are for some slightly more complex equations. So we're going to come down here to 4 and 5. 4 and 5 actually go together. They're two things that we're going to do at the same time. First thing that we're going to look at is using the reverse order of operations. Okay, we're going to work backwards using reverse order of operations. So back in middle school, you learned order of operations. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Okay, and you know that you need to work in that order. In algebra, we need to work in the exact opposite direction to undo those things. And if we're going to undo those things, we're not going to use those operations that we see on the paper. We're going to use the inverse operations. So we're going to use inverse operations and reverse order of operations to get those variables by themselves. Then once we have that variable by itself, we're going to check our solution. And the way that we check the solution is real simple. We sub it back into the original and make sure that it works. Okay. Now, I've got a star down here. One thing that I want us to keep an eye out for, and this is something that I saw a lot of us really struggling with, the negatives. If you see negatives, slow yourself down and think for a second, okay? So think about those negatives. Okay, as you're working through the equation and you're trying to solve it, there's going to come times where you have negatives that you're operating with. And negative arithmetic, sometimes it's tough for us to do in our heads. But you know what, guys? You're allowed to use a calculator if you need to. There's no rule in my class that says you can't. Okay, so don't be afraid of using a calculator if you need to. But also, if you take your time and you think about those negatives and think about what they actually mean, it might be a whole lot easier and you might not need a calculator. Okay, but let's take a look at these examples right here. So I've got 5x minus 9 equals 71. So the very first thing I want to do before anything else, I want to draw that vertical line through the equal sign. And that's going to help me keep this equation balanced. Because now I know whatever I do to get that x by itself, I also need to do the exact same thing over here. So this x is being multiplied by 5, and then they're subtracting 9. If I go in reverse order of operations, the last thing that happened was that minus 9. So that's the first thing that I have to undo using the inverse operations. So the opposite, the inverse of subtracting, is adding. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides of this equation. Minus 9 and plus 9 gives me 0. It totally cancels out. So all I have left now is 5x. Okay, those two are going to cancel. On the right side, 71 plus 9 is 80. Now, if I want to get that x all the way by itself, I still need to keep working backwards with inverse operations. So the opposite of multiplying by 5 is going to be dividing both sides by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 1 times x is just x. 80 divided by 5 is 16. So I end up with x equals 16. Now, if I take this x back to the original equation and sub it in, I should get 71. So if I take 16, multiply it by 5, and then subtract 9. Now keep in mind, guys, without that x, once that x is gone, it's regular old operations and regular old order of operations. So 5 times 16, that's going to be 80. And 80 minus 9 is 71. The solution checks out. I can say x equals 16. Okay? Okay, next up, example 2. I have 1/2 times x plus 3 equals 9. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw that vertical line down through the equal sign. Okay, and that helps me keep this equation balanced. Now, next up, reverse order of operations, inverse operations to get that variable by itself. So it's getting multiplied by 1/2, and then they're adding 3. Now that half is going to make us kind of freeze up a little bit. We don't like fractions, but guys, it's just a number. It doesn't change what we do. Okay, I'm still going to work backwards to get this by itself. So x is getting multiplied by 9, and then they're adding 3. So the first thing we're going to do is the opposite. Subtract that 3 from both sides. 3 minus 3 is 0. 1/2 x plus 0 is just 1/2 x. Okay, those 3's cancel. And then 9 minus 3 is 6. Now, I need to divide both sides by 1/2. They're multiplying by 1/2, I have to divide by 1/2. But if you think back to middle school, when you learned about how to do arithmetic on fractions, we learned that if you divide by 1/2, divide by a fraction, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2/1, which, guys, is the exact same thing as just 2. Now, 1/2 times 2/1 is going to give me 2/2, which is just 1. So 1 times x is x. Those fractions are all gone. And 6 times 2 is 12. Now, before I circle that answer and say that we're done, I'll take that 12, sub it in here in place of x. So 1/2 times 12 plus 3. 1/2 times 12 is 6. 6 plus 3 gives me 9. Solution checks out, and I can say that x equals 12. Okay, now let's take a look at some other ones. Now, it's no different what we're really going to do. Okay, the equation looks a little bit different, but what we do is no different at all. So first off, vertical line. Next up, reverse order of operations, inverse operations. So that w is being subtracted by 5, and then they're dividing by that 9. So we're going to do the opposite. The last thing they did was divide that 9. The first thing we're going to do is multiply both sides by 9. If you're multiplying by 9 and dividing by 9, those are inverse operations, and they're going to cancel. What someone's going to suggest is that we distribute that 9. If we distribute that 9, then we're going to have to divide everything by 9, kind of distribute the division, and that's going to be pretty complex. The whole point of doing the inverse is so that these can cancel. So those 9s, multiplying by 9, divided by 9, those are inverse operations. They cancel one another out. And all I have left over here is w minus 5. Then negative 2 times 9 is going to be negative 18. Okay, now we're almost done. That w is still being subtracted by 5, so we're going to do the opposite, which is adding 5 to both sides. Now, negative 5 plus 5 cancels. These are gone, and I have w minus 0, or just w. Now, on the right side, I've got negative 18 plus 5, and this is where students tend to get a little mixed up. So let's just slow down and think about this for a second. Let's think about this like a number line. So on a number line, here's 0, negative 18 is over here. If I'm adding 5, adding goes to the right. Now, if I'm 18 steps into the negatives, adding 5 is not going to be enough to get me past 0 into the positives. I'm still going to be in the negatives, but I'm getting closer to 0, which means it's going to have a smaller negative value. So 5 steps to the right of negative 18 is negative 13, and that's going to be our answer right here. And if we want to be 100% sure, take that solution back to the original and sub it in. So negative 13 minus 5 divided by 9. Now this time, here we are with our number line. Here's negative 13. If we're subtracting, we're going further left. We're getting further away from 0. So negative 13 minus 5 is going to land us over here at negative 18. And negative 18 divided by 9 is negative 2, which checks out with our original equation. So we can say that W equals negative 13. Okay, one more that we can take a look at. Okay, I've got 5y plus 7 equals negative 28. So the first thing we'll do is draw that vertical line, and then we'll use inverse operations in reverse order of operations to get that y all by itself. So they're multiplying by 5, and then they're adding 7. The opposite would be to subtract 7 from each side. Now 7 minus 7 on the left side cancels, and we just have 5y. On the right side, got a negative. No big deal. So here's our 0. Here's negative 28. Now if we're subtracting, we're going to the left. We're going deeper into the negatives. 7 steps. So if I'm at negative 28 and I'm getting deeper into the negatives, I take 7 steps. That's going to land me at negative 35. Okay, then lastly, need to get that y by itself. Divide both sides by 5. They're multiplying by 5. We'll divide by 5. These 5's cancel. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 1 times y is just y. And then over here, negative 35 divided by 5. A negative divided by a positive is going to be negative 7. Okay? Now, take that negative 7, sub it all the way back into the original, and make sure that it works. So 5 times negative 7 plus 7. 5 times negative 7 is negative 35 plus 7. Okay, think that number line again. Here we are, way in the negatives at negative 35, and we take 7 steps closer to 0. We're not going to pass 0. We're still going to be in the negatives, but we're going to be closer to that 0. So negative 35 plus 7 is negative 28. Solution checks out, and we can say that y equals negative 7. Now, guys, as always, if you're struggling with the arithmetic, just grab a calculator. There's no rule in my class that says you can't use one, so use one if you need to. If you can do the arithmetic in your head and you're confident with it, cool, do that. Okay? Now, let's take a look one more time. Vertical line right down the middle. The whole point of that is that's going to help us keep the equation balanced. Make sure that we're doing the same thing on both sides all the time. Okay? Then, using reverse order of operations and inverse operations, get that variable by itself. These two kind of go together. Last thing that we always need to do, check that solution. Even if you just take the solution, take that 12 and sub it into this and punch it all into a calculator, that's fine. But check the answer, make sure that it's a good one. Okay, and as always, take your time and think about those negatives. If you're not super confident, you're still kind of unsure, use a calculator. It's fine. Okay, if you would rather do the arithmetic by hand, think number line. Okay, that number line's never going to fail. It's always going to be right. Take your time and it'll help you. Okay. All right, guys, there's an assignment posted to Canvas. This video is posted to Canvas. If you have any questions, please make sure you contact me one way or another. I look forward to working with you guys.